that we've been exploring have simply been what's causing it and what can we do about it. And over that same time period, our team has been meeting diligently to discuss how we can approach every aspect of these challenges, including using local, state, and federal resources to provide a lifeline to some neighborhoods while prospectively addressing future development to limit the impact of excessive water. The presentation will provide you, members of the council, and our community an overview of the areas that have experienced issues, and we'll also look specifically at some of our neighbors that have brought their plight to our attention. David Smith, our Director of Streets, has done some exhaustive research and will lead that part of the presentation. Mr. Smith, with a generous assist from our newly created GIS division, has some impressive information to share with you. Lauren Winters, our Grants Director, has become our subject matter expert in FEMA and TEMA reimbursements. Unfortunately, she's had one tornado and 2 wind events over the last 5 years, along with historic rainfall we've experienced this year, that has led her to be what we call fondly our FEMA guru. We'll talk about qualifications for FEMA reimbursements for individual property owners and that arduous process. Ms. Winters will also discuss how we will help property owners maneuver through the paperwork and that process. Justin Crosby, our Building Codes Director, will end the presentation with some helpful information for home buyers and builders. What the presentation is not, however, is the end of this process. You'll see and hear discussions about possible solutions and the direction we're heading this budget year. This will be what I classify as an interim report, with more information to follow as we get further into our study of the challenges. As always, you've been provided printed copies of the presentation to make notes as Mr. Smith, Ms. Winters, and Mr. Crosby talk about their parts. Please save your questions to the end. We'll make this presentation and the recording available to the public via the city's website tomorrow. So without further ado, Mr. Smith, if you would, please lead us off.
All right, new microphone, so bear with me. Okay, so as the mayor mentioned, please hold your questions till the end. Full disclosure, I'm not a geologist, hydrologist, or any of those things. I'm a layperson in this, other than the fact that I'm Director of the Street Department and Stormwater Management. So as we roll through this, there's a lot of visuals, there's a lot of information. It'll be on each of the screens. You guys will see a cursor that appears time to time. If you have any point of emphasis, I'll place that over that area, and it should be a little more transparent. So today, as the mayor mentioned, we're going to talk about some of the terms associated with stormwater management. We're going to look at some of our recent rainfall data. We're going to pull some of those unique case studies, and then Lauren will jump up and talk about some of the FEMA-TEMA assistance that may or may not be available. Some of those terms, and I won't read through all of these, I won't bore you to tears, but you're going to hear me mention a lot of this stuff, the 100-year floodplain of the 1%. Let me qualify that for a moment. That means in a calendar year, there's a 1% chance that we're going to have a rainfall event like that, 1%. So 99%, it's not going to happen. An injection well, a sinkhole, these are common features associated with storm drainage, and I'll typically call those features throughout the presentation. But again, as the mayor mentioned, this is going to be available for you tomorrow, so you'll be able to see all of this. And again, drainage feature. One thing, let's talk about this for a minute because it's kind of fresh, I think, in everybody's mind and certainly in the news. A natural disaster is a phenomenon that overwhelms local resources, and we've seen that recently with some of the hurricanes and whatnot. And please rest assured that a 100-year flood event is a natural disaster. FEMA declares it such, we declare it such, and it overwhelms infrastructure resources. What does that look like? Well, I guess the video is probably not, there we go. So that's our local system. That's some of our stormwater system downtown. That's in May. That system's designed to convey a specific amount of stormwater. That's in excess of that. That's what happens to our system. Now, that's a natural disaster, as evidenced by that. So let's talk about karst topography because that's the area that we live in. And I want to spend a few minutes on this slide because I want to reference a couple of points here. You see sinkholes, you see debris, you see, streams, rivers, those sorts of things. What you don't see is this subterranean area, and you see this system of caves, and you see this other line through there that's the groundwater table. That's what we're going to talk about a lot today, that groundwater table. That's a familiar term for anybody that's ever dug a well. Anytime a well is installed, you dig to find that groundwater table. Here in Clarksville, that groundwater table migrates up, down, and so on, depending on how much rain we've got. Notice the cave system. Look at how deep some of those cave systems are. When those caves are full, there's nowhere for this water to go. It saturates and it rises above and out of those features. So we see this a lot in Clarksville, right? That's a sinkhole. Everybody sees that. They're on social media. I've got a sinkhole. They see that in the road. I've got a sinkhole. And it's reported as such. Is it a sinkhole? No. In this case, that's a broken water line. You guys can't see it there, but it's off to the left side. The water line that's under pressure. The water has nowhere to go. What does it do? It washes out the substrate. The road can't sustain it, falls in. It's not a sinkhole. It's not a naturally occurring feature. We saw this one. This is oof, it's not too old. You guys recognize that picture? And immediately, images circulated. It's a sinkhole. And it was through social media in no time. Was it a sinkhole? Absolutely not. Lauren Winters actually shared with me, some of the historians of Clarksville on social media defeated that. It's an old cistern. Helped us locate it. Very, very large structure that belonged to some of the previous buildings that occupied that lot, maybe even before the parking garage that was there prior to. It's not a sinkhole. Absolutely. Cenote Samalua in sinkhole. It's a common vacation spot. I wouldn't encourage anybody to find a sinkhole like that here in Clarksville, but if the sediment and whatnot had completely eroded from any of our local sinkholes, that is a limestone sinkhole. Notice at the top, the throat. That's what we commonly see open up, and once that sediment completely washes away, that area they're swimming is the groundwater table, and that's subject to travel up and down depending on seasonal rainfall. So we are not the only community that has sinkholes. Any area that has limestone and karst topography, this is a common feature. So what's happening this year? That 100-year event that we talked about, that 1% chance, 99% chance it's not going to happen twice in the month of May alone. 2 times. 200-year events. So we talked about that groundwater table. After the first event, when we were already saturated, when those caves that we mentioned a few moments ago were full, it rained again, and it rained at a level equal to. And it's not necessarily always the amount of rain, but the rate that the rain comes down that inundates the system. Everybody remembers this is 2010. We remember the 2010 flood, widely circulated. That's the Two Rivers Mall, under one river at present. The Cumberland, that's Boot Hill, for those that aren't familiar with the area. Riverside Drive, completely impassable. And we've got an image here. This is from the National Weather Service. This is locally collected information, but it's at the national level. 2010 flood we just looked at. That's the blue bar graph. The light blue left to right line, that's our average rainfall. The 2010 flood, the red line's May of this year. We got that much more rain in May of this year than what put Riverside Drive underwater. I need that to, I say saturate, but I need you guys to really, to observe how much more rainfall that is. If you look at some of that, look at August. 1/2 inch in the month of August. 15 inches of rain in May, primarily in 2 events. So some relevant dates, because this is going to come up as we talk about annexations, we talk about plats, and we talk about kind of the evolution of Clarksville. 1968, late 60s, National Flood Insurance Program. Federal government starts to say, wait a minute, we've got a problem, we need to do something about it. 72 Clean Water Act. FEMA doesn't get created until 1979. I need you to remember that date on these subsequent slides. 1979, FEMA is created. One of the things that Ms. Winters is going to talk about is hazard mitigation. It didn't exist until 1988. Justin won't mention it, but in 2000, the International Building Code was published. And what that did, that took all of these pieces of legislation and consolidated them to the development and building process. It said we need to incorporate this to how homes are built, how developments are devised. So here's Clarksville pre-1962. That's it. That's the city limits. Everything else unincorporated. Between the years 62 and 79, we picked up New Providence, not Providence. You're welcome, sir. In some of our South Clarksville region. From 80 to 99, we picked up St. Bethlehem. 80 to 99, St. Bethlehem, that region. And then, of course, we've had some recent annexations on the periphery that Mr. Tyndall has brought forward to us and beyond, and that's those areas there in purple. So we're going to look at some case studies. And again, remember the dates that we covered. We can jump back later in Q&A and whatnot and cover that. We're going to run through these. Again, we'll start. Most of this follows kind of a timeline, but we're going to start with Cook Drive because it's probably the most fresh for those here. So this is Hawkins Hills. This is circa 2018. This is the plat. This is a common plat that we see and we approve. You've got a 100-year flood easement in the backside of this property, and you've got 4, 5, 6 properties that were developed as a result. You can see the topography tapering down to this area, but notice the parcel, notice the property itself. This 100-year easement takes up 2 or 3 of these properties. Okay, absolutely. All right, so this is a 100-year flood easement back here, all the way to this boundary line right here. And these are topography lines stepping down at 1 to 2 foot per. So the house is built up here. What this affords us is the ability to build basement lots and stuff like that, which are very palatable here in Tennessee because we have the wind events and whatnot. So this is Hawkins Hills 2018. Just about every subdivision in Clarksville that's platted has an area like this that surrounds a drainage basin that's designed to hold water. This is Cook Drive. Cook Drive received a lot of concern. There were a lot of emails. Compare the two. Cook Drive has more level area before it tapers off. Less of the property is impacted by the 100-year elevation, and this met significant resistance. Every subdivision, I'll say that, every subdivision in town has an area that's holding water. The natural flow law, and I didn't reference that earlier, but TDEC, the Design Standards of Tennessee, stormwater is governed by the natural flow law. You have to take the uphill water of the adjacent property. So this is an existing 100-year easement. And this builder was proposing to replat and protect that 100-year easement and keep the preponderance of the property outside of that easement. Again, that's kind of a parallel, but yet a contrast to Hawkins Hills, which was passed, and those homes, those are built. So that's the overlay. You've got this 100-year easement that affects these properties. These people have to have flood insurance, and they back up to these properties. Well, we don't necessarily get calls about this particular development, but again, just wanted to draw the parallel to Hawkins Hills because I know that we got a bunch of calls about Cook Drive, and there were some questions about how we could permit that, why we were okay with that, and just kind of wanted to daylight that. But let's scroll back in time just a bit. Here we have the Hayes and Love Street intersection. This is a plat from 1964. Remember those dates. NFIP 68, FEMA 79, hazard mitigation 1988. These are legal lots. They're legal non-conforming at this point, but they're allowed to be built on and whatnot. To say that you can't build on these lots, to assert control over these lots would be a taking. And we know what that looks like. We're going to say that you can't do it, we got to buy it. So let's talk about the situation at this property. This is the drainage area. You guys might recognize Trenton Road, Wilma Rudolph Boulevard. This is the area that drains to a couple of features near Hayes and Love. And what we're gonna so you can see the blue line that runs around here. This entire hundreds of acres, okay, this blue line that chases, drains to a couple of features within this footprint. And we're gonna zoom into all that stuff here in just a moment. So this is what it looks like. This is the blue map. The green areas are the highest points, with the red and purple areas being the deepest points. And again, we'll focus in here in just a minute, but those arrows indicate the direction that the stormwater in this subdivision is flooding, or rather flowing. My apologies. This is kind of an enhanced view of the Hayes and Love Street. So this is, of course, Hayes Street. This is Love Street. You guys can kind of see some of these arrows. This is the direction the water is flowing within each of those ditches. And you can see this crater at the north side of this image. It's kind of like the moon, if you will. That is a feature. That is the natural feature in this area that accepts water and has accepted water for 60 years. It was there before this subdivision was constructed. It's there today, and it still takes on that volume of water. Now, we've had some issues. We've had some flooding. This is just kind of a 100-year map and a 500-year map generically drawn with some of the lines of topography. It's very, very busy, but when you guys get a chance after the fact, I would encourage you to study this and ask any questions that you might have. But these are the images we get. We get images like this that say, my property's flooded. The city has done something. What can the city do to help? Let's jump back a moment. So let's talk about the feature here on the north side that we don't own. We don't own it. It's on private property. We have a small drainage easement, and that's this arrow running to the centralized portion of that feature. We know for 60 years this has functioned, and I'll put air quotes around functioned. We know that we experience around an acre of flooding that traverses this property and the boundary of this property. We see some standing water in those May 100-year events. The question was asked, can we buy this lot? Can we manipulate this lot? Can we improve the amount? Can we store, retain, detain water on this lot to help with flooding? And the answer is probably. But let me qualify that. That qualify is probably about 10% to 15%. That's about how much we can get in a compensatory cut. I've got to say, if that's the approach, it's a very dangerous approach. We have a naturally occurring feature that has functioned flawlessly for 60 years. If we manipulate that feature and cause it to collapse, cause it to compromise, we're not dealing with an acre of flooding. We're dealing with potentially dozens or even 100 acres of flooding in a standard non-100-year rain event. So again, the question is, does it merit the attention? Does it merit going in and buying this lot and attempting something? If it collapses, could we repair it? Yes, to the tune of 7 figures. So that's the question that's before the council. That's not a decision that I get to make, but this is not a problem borne by the city. This is a development that was crafted in 1962. We annexed this property, you saw the map, in the 80s. We inherited this property when this property was annexed. So there wasn't a development on the corner of Hayes and Loves that caused this. There wasn't anything other than Mother Nature and that water table that we mentioned earlier, because what you'll see in a subsequent image, we saw this in the May event. Helene just came through. 4 inches of rain in 24 hours. There's no standing water. That's 4 inches of rain in 24 hours. That's the system operating as designed with a water table that's not impacted because we didn't just have a 100-year flood or any kind of saturating rain that preceded it. You can see the streets soaking wet. That image was taken. It's a date-stamped image. I can provide that to you. So the system works. The natural feature works. Remember, 100-year events are natural disasters. They're not city-caused disasters. No more than the tornado was a city. What are we going to do to stop the next tornado? Are we going to go out and improve roads? That won't have an impact. We can't stop flooding. Alberta and Freestone, this is another one that's been really, really prevalent. 1966, before an FIP, before FEMA, the folks that have said this development, these homes were built substandard, they were built to the standard at the time. They were built honest. That's another kind of a zoom in. So that's kind of a zoomed out, apologies. That's the plat and just a zoomed in image there of that lot. So here's the property. Here's what we call the basin. At the bottom of the hill, it's roughly 7 acres. This is a generic, I promise. This is not a FEMA designated 100-year. This is our best guess. Again, as the mayor mentioned earlier, it's taken us time to study this. Developing this and other features has taken a tremendous amount of time, survey work and so on, transits on site to develop what this elevation is. This is actually a newer development here, and they helped us with some of that 100-year elevation information. Now, you notice the home I just referenced sits right here, well within that. The home here at the corner is affected. This is a two-dimensional model. So just because the water traverses that area doesn't mean that the flooding level is above finished floor, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. That same bloom map again, in that same area showing the subdivision water flowing to the bottom of the neighborhood. Again, TDEC standards, Tennessee law, natural flow rule. Everything is flowing. You can't impede that. You can't impact that. It has to flow to the lowest point. It was rather erroneously reported recently that the reason Alberta Drive flooded was a blocked storm drain. I can promise you nothing is further from the truth. There is no blocked storm drain. There's no storm drain out there. There is an injection well at right there at the Yellow Donut that assists with, it's an injection well. That was one of the definitions from earlier. It helps divert some of the water and directs it to a seam. But again, this is the lowest point of this neighborhood. When it rains and the water table rises, this is underwater. The question was, could we go out there and could we provide a compensatory cut? Could we cut through this area and provide ponding, if you will, or detain and retain water? And the answer is yes, we can do that. But again, it's the same threshold that we talked about in Hayes and Love Street. Once that water table comes up, it doesn't matter how deep these holes we dig are. They're full of water, just like a well would be. So one of the things that Lauren's going to mention here just a little bit, these are the homes that are directly affected by what we believe is to be the 100-year through that area. And those residents have been sent through a rather arduous process with TEMA and FEMA, a brief questionnaire that's going to help us fill out some of those applications. But again, that's the green arrow there. Apologies, the green arrow is not the yellow one. That's our that feature that we mentioned, that injection well. But these are the images that we get. This is what happens on site. The home on your left is the area and the water was higher than this. So that's not a blocked storm drain. That is a water table at the base or the basin. Nothing's going to assist with that. No amount of blocked storm drains could contribute to that point. Another issue that you guys saw was Danielle and Spees Drive. This is 92. We're getting a little newer. Again, we're evolving in the timeline. This plat records a drainage easement. It shows it's our intent, the developer's intent, and ultimately deeded to us to convey water across this area. This is the area in question, and you guys can kind of see it there. I'll do that one more time there in the bottom right. We've got that drainage easement kind of exploded. One thing I want to point out here, that dotted yellow line is the county. So this is a property in the city limits that sheds water to the county. This county shed is a wetland. That's a federally protected wetland. That water, those species, both plant and animal that live in that area are highly protected by the federal government. They may not have been even in the 90s, but they certainly are now. And manipulation of that area, an effort to try and draw water from that area and whatnot is heavily regulated. Same map that you guys saw before. Again, it's very, very flat. That purple area, it holds water. It can be June, several weeks without rain, and it's a pond and the mosquitoes and holy smokes. It's a lot. And again, you still see that same easement, because we're going to zoom into that here in just a minute. This is unique in that we asked FEMA a number of years ago to study this. This is FEMA's 100-year and 500-year, that's that 0.2, elevation through these areas. FEMA said these are the areas that are going to flood in a 100-year and 500-year circumstance. As we zoom into the area in question, that's the drainage easement. 558 Danielle Drive, I believe you all got an email on that. You can see the area affected by the 100-year and 500-year plain. It traverses our easement, it traverses the properties behind there, and ultimately that water migrates to the north, to the wetland. And again, there's your FEMA flood area. We don't have that on all these properties. Lauren's going to talk to you about a consequence of having those FEMA overlays, and that's flood insurance, but she'll get into all that in her subsequent presentation. And again, one more close-up of that 558 Danielle Drive. That's the easement. If you drive to the property, you'll see that we have a concrete flume that helps evacuate the water because it's super flat. I mean, it's less than 1% of fall, so we're moving water across that at a very slow pace. But we get an image of this. So I've got water, it's ponding. Again, this is in May. This is our 100-year event. Notice the porch there at the bottom. You see the porch is not underwater. The finished floor of the home is not underwater, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But the water is in the area as designated by FEMA, and maybe even a little bit beyond. It's probably, we don't have the 500-year float on there, but just to show you the volume of water we got. Again, not a block storm drain, none of those things. This water is ultimately all naturally going to flow to the north, to the wetland just up there that we mentioned. Vaughn Road, again, earlier still, 1977. We've got, actually, I guess we're moving back here a little bit. Oh, holy smokes. This is Vaughn Road. For those that don't know, this is over by Publix off of Highway 76. This is lot 4. This gentleman came, the owner, and appealed to TSG. He's made several phone calls and has sent several emails about the conditions on his property. What are the conditions on his property? We've got 1/3 of an acre that U.S. Fish and Wildlife designated as a protected wetland. And I'm going to try to pronounce this, Palestrin Emergent Persistent Class C. That's their U.S. Fish and Wildlife, a federal agency designation, circa 1981. That designation means that this property seasonally floods. This was built on in the mid-'80s. Again, FEMA's fledgling. This isn't part of the city. This is in the county. We inherit this. The home was built. Now, overlaid today, that's the home, that's the driveway, that's the protected wetland as designated by U.S. Fish and Wildlife and ultimately the federal government. This property floods. And it floods exactly where U.S. Fish and Wildlife said it was designed to flood. There is a specific feature that's under this property. So this is an entire network of caves that runs under Publix and runs all through this area. It's a really, really expansive cave network. But again, it fills with water, and when that water fills those, it evacuates up through the throat, and you see it daylight there at the surface. So again, different circumstance. This is another wetland, and this is designed, again, a natural feature that was capped by a driveway. The throat of this is actually capped by the driveway, and I believe the resident can tell you the driveway actually failed at one point, and there was some additional pumping into the sewer system to help evacuate this water. You can see some of that infrastructure on the left of this image. When you guys get the presentation, you can see some of the efforts that the resident was taking to save his finished floor elevation. All right, we're getting pretty new. So we've got Glen Ellen Landing. This is section 4. This gentleman sent out an email, and I saw some social media buzz on this as well, and I saw some chatter from that community, that network. This is a 100-year flood elevation. No structure or fill to be built in this area, and you guys see a couple of notes here. It says it's the responsibility of the subdivider or the owner to maintain these areas. It further says that these lots in question, of which 225 is one, must provide a flood elevation certificate because they are in a floodplain. So this is all information provided at closing. That's a big stack of paperwork that you get. Hey, you're out of floodplain on your property. Gentleman provides an email. You guys saw this email. It says, and it's actually really well drawn. It shows the purple is the property, the blue, red, green line are the different areas, and he says, I reported this multiple times, and nothing's getting done. The city won't do anything to help. Again, you saw the plat. You see the notes on the plat. It's not the city's responsibility to maintain. That's a very large lot. It's a very large lot because it's designed to hold water. We get images like this. I can't use 2/3 of my property. Something's got to be done. The city has got to get involved. The city has not got to get involved. The plat clearly identifies the responsibility here. So, again, you see an image like this. You see another image like we have on Samantha Drive. Look just how much of this property is monopolized by this easement. 2/3 of this property, again, is 100-year flood easement, and look, no structure or fill to be in this drainage easement. Playgrounds, trampolines, sheds, fences, these are structures. That's the picture that's on social media. It's not that we're not sympathetic. We understand that there's loss associated with that, but the loss wasn't caused by the city. When we see that overlaid, that's the 100-year easement overlaid with their fence. Looks an awful lot like where the water is. The engineer said, this property will flood. This is the 100-year basin, and that's where it's going to flood in those events. But there's an outpouring. The city's got to do something to help. And this is an excerpt from the Stormwater Manual. It says that we're not responsible for these features, for these easements. Our responsibility is that they flow. We see folks that drop grass clippings in these constantly, tree branches constantly. They build sheds in 100-year easements and impede the storm flow. They level out their backyards to put in swimming pools and impede the storm flow, and then we have problems. This wasn't permitted. These weren't permitted practices. So small drainage systems, beyond that of city maintenance responsibility, individual landowners, those large features, the throat of a large feature, those kinds of things like we see on Armistead and whatnot, we will go after major events and we will remove all of the trash, because I know we see images online of a bunch of sticks and garbage that's concentrated at these low points. It's kind of like a bathtub drain. The water comes out, everything concentrates to that point. They weren't impacted. They weren't obstructed prior to. They're obstructed after the fact when all of that water evacuates. Something that Mr. Crosby requires on any one of those lots that we saw in Glen Ellen that said you've got to have a FEMA flood certificate. This is a stamped FEMA flood certificate, and there's some information on here. The base flooding elevation, I want to point out, at 409 feet there at the top right. Very, very relevant. That's how much the 100-year, that's where it's going to flood. That's the elevation. Hey, look, you can't build anywhere around this. The second is that FFE, or finished floor elevation. It has to be at least a foot or two above that base elevation. You can see in this property, it's 417, it's well above it. But we have some out there that are just a couple of feet, 2, 3, 4 feet above it. That's compliant. But when you have rain events and it's only a couple feet above that, you're going to have water standing in the yard. This is kind of a brief image of that, of what we talked about in some of this. You've got a 10-year, and we see a lot of those 10-year events. The one, or that 99% chance it's not going to happen event that we design our system to, and that all of our designs are required to comply with. But then you get that 500-year towards the top, and you can see that in a 500-year flood, we've got homes with finished floors that are completely submerged and whatnot. So lowest grade, again, that was on that subsequent. When you look at that, you've got lowest adjacent grade that's here. You've got finished floor elevation, and you've got some of those. Again, this is from 2008, so this isn't a new process. This is a process the Codes Department's been doing for some time. Again, referencing the 2000 adoption of the building code. So again, 10-year, 100-year elevation, you'll hear me say it often, and then the 500-year elevation, different design standards. The design standard, not only here but regionally, nationally, is 100-year elevation. When we get to the coast, I mean, this kind of looks like a picture of the coast. All of the coastal homes, you guys go to the beach, you'll see the homes are built up on stilts in essence. That's because of the storm surge. They're all built within flood elevation. So the finished floor of the home is built above that storm surge level, but the home and the property will be submerged. And that's what we see around the Red, around the Little West Fork and that sort of stuff. We see properties that go underwater, but the home doesn't. The finished floor doesn't. I'm going to turn it over to Lauren. I will be back for questions. Lauren's going to jump in. Thank you.
I apologize in advance if I clear my throat. I've tried to save my voice for y'all. Okay, good evening. My name is Lauren Winters, and as the mayor mentioned, I am the city's grants director, and part of my role includes working with FEMA and TEMA for both public assistance and hazard mitigation. This evening, I'm going to give you a brief overview of FEMA and their hazard mitigation process as it is related to property acquisition. And I want to start by saying that I've worked very closely with TEMA to present user-friendly, concise, and accurate information regarding the program. So what is FEMA? First, let's talk exactly about what FEMA is. I know Mr. Smith already touched on some of this history briefly, so we'll kind of skip past the first and the second. We know FEMA was established in 1979, and the Stafford Act of 1988 provided disaster management framework. In 2002, President Bush established the Department of Homeland Security, which combined FEMA and 21 other organizations into one. The Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018, so just 6 years ago, provided legislation which highlighted the federal government's ability and commitment to invest in mitigation. Now, you might be wondering, why am I giving you a history lesson? I wanted to highlight not only the creation of FEMA in 1979, which is after several of the properties shown tonight, but also I wanted to highlight the relative infancy of the hazard mitigation program, which was reformed through the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. So what exactly is hazard mitigation? Hazard mitigation is any action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people and property from natural disasters and their effects. Who is eligible to apply? States, local communities, and private nonprofits can apply on behalf of citizens. And there are multiple types of hazard mitigation. We talk the most about acquisition and demolition, but there's also elevation, mitigation, reconstruction, retrofitting, such as protective barriers, etc. So FEMA hazard mitigation as it relates to us. So the city has previously purchased individual homes and properties utilizing FEMA's hazard mitigation grant process, or HMGP. TEMA administers this grant program for the state of Tennessee. So we have FEMA, the big one, and then TEMA is our state delegation for that. Clarksville submitted a notice of intent in July of 2024 related to the May 2024 storms. And as Mr. Smith mentioned, we are in the process of completing the extensive applications to assist homeowners affected by recent flooding. And we have requested additional information from a set of affected homeowners to determine both their interest and eligibility. And I believe Ms. Camfield provided a copy of those questions to you all. So let's talk a little bit about eligibility. In order for a property to be eligible to participate in the property acquisition program, there is a list of criteria that first must be met. First, there must be 3 years of documented loss, and this could be multiple events within a year. However, it still counts as 1 year. So for example, the 2 events that occurred in May, it's 1 year. God forbid, another event occurs this calendar year, it is 1 year. There must also be backup documentation supporting the multiple years of loss. This can include insurance filings. Even with denials, we have to have insurance filings. Pictures showing measurements and watermarks, repair and replacement receipts, and hotel receipts displaying displacement if required. Again, all of this I've spoke with TEMA. We've kind of tried to come up with a more user-friendly way of presenting it. Also worth mentioning, the monetary loss from the 3 years of events must be under the current property owner. However, if there is sufficient documentation from prior ownership, FEMA can utilize storm data as well as that prior owner's insurance claims and rejections. It is also important to note that any insurance proceeds that were received from any of the reported events on the property must be documented and provided to FEMA, as that money is required to go back into the repair of the home. There will also need to be an elevation certificate which shows the home is in a flood zone, and this will require the city to pay FEMA to remap the areas as each of the properties we have looked at were not in a current FEMA identified flood zone. I know Mr. Smith showed you where he and the GIS team have worked to kind of come up with this localized flood map, but as far as FEMA is concerned, you can go to the GIS system, to the assessor's website, and you will see that these properties are not in a FEMA flood zone. Ultimately, FEMA has the final say on which applications receive funding, even if they are considered eligible upon submission. The city works directly with FEMA, who then submits those projects to FEMA. So there are other alternate cost-effective solutions that FEMA and FEMA look into. That could include elevating the home, placing drains, etc. It is important to note that FEMA has the ultimate decision on what it believes to be the value/reimbursable demolition costs. If insurance proceeds have previously been received for flooding events, it will be deducted from those costs. If acquired and demolished utilizing the hazard mitigation program, the city must retain ownership and use of the property for a non-building purpose. This can include drainage mitigation. The property would also have a deed restriction that it can never be built on. And the city must maintain the property, and it would no longer appear on the tax roll. FEMA pays 75% of the cost, and FEMA covers the remaining 12.5% of that 25% local share. Not every state does that. The state of Tennessee is unique in that. So I don't know about y'all, but I'm very much a list person. I like a timeline. I like dates. I wish I could give you definitive dates if we move forward tonight on these applications. As you all know, just from watching the news, there are natural disasters, it feels like every other week, which significantly impacts this timeline. But if I could get a crystal ball, this is what I believe to be a good timeline. So this month and next month, October and November 2024, determining the property's eligibility and ordering elevation certificates and FEMA mapping as required. I want to pause right here and say, if you've been watching the news, they're talking about FEMA's understaffed for all the natural events that are occurring. I do not want to speak to how high on the priority list some potential FEMA flood mapping might be in Clarksville relative to other FEMA events. But again, in my perfect world crystal ball, stay with me here. December 2024, the applications, that should be applications, would be submitted to FEMA. Each property is its own application, but they move together as one group. January to March 2025, FEMA reviews the application and submits requests for additional information as needed. I would like to think that I can submit an application that's 100% right all the time. There's always new information they want. Whether it's a form has changed, something's passed, something's been adopted. We've had some generator applications for parks and the fire department that were submitted 18 months ago that are still going through additional requests for information. May 2025, any additional request for information has been completed, and FEMA can then look to assign it to a disaster and a funding source. I want to pause right there. That doesn't mean it's approved. That doesn't mean it's awarded. That just means FEMA says, hey, this looks great. I can send it to FEMA when they're ready to receive it, when there's a disaster that provides funding. In my perfect world, December 2025 projects would be assigned to a funding source and submitted to FEMA. That asterisk right there, that is contingent on funding availability. So we recently had historic and catastrophic flooding occur in East Tennessee. In our state, that is considered a Tier 1 affected and declared area for funding. Tier 2 would be the eastern region, and then any funding that Tier 1 and Tier 2 did not utilize would then be open to the rest of the state. So that is just my best guess. December 2025 funding would be available for this to be assigned. December 2025 to July 2026 would be a multi-phase review by technical EHP, which is Environmental Historic Preservation, as well as what they call a 106 review, which is a mandatory 90 days. That is for any structure over 49 years old. August 2026, the projects are approved after all of those reviews because we would hope they just slide through seamlessly. And then the city and property owners would be ready to enter into state contracts. I don't want you to think it's a typo. August 2026, we're ready for a contract. August 2027, 1 year later, FEMA and the state would issue contracts. Again, that is based on my experience, whether it is with COVID vaccination, whether it's with the wind event, the tornado. It is about a year from the application being approved to actually receiving a contract. They are working to get that whittled down from 12 months, but that is the reality of where we are at. So winter 2027 into early 2028, perfect world, is when I truly believe we would have property acquisition and demolition. The above timeline is contingent on the property passing the benefit cost analysis, or the BCA, and other FEMA declared disasters in our state and funding availability. So per FEMA, if you conduct flood mapping, which is a BCA requirement, a benefit cost analysis requirement, and the property is determined to be within a flood zone, they will be required to get flood insurance. This applies to any home within the flood map, not just the current affected property owner. This could mean that currently unaffected property owners in the surrounding area would now find themselves in a FEMA-identified floodplain. Please note that this insurance is not a city requirement. Rather, this would be a lender's requirement for existing and new mortgages. Existing in a newly identified FEMA flood map also does not guarantee the property's eligibility. Those 3 years of documented loss, as well as the elevation certificate, must support that need in that benefit cost analysis. Also, just a little tidbit of information, the average annual premium for flood insurance in Tennessee is $991. Again, that is contingent on location, flood zone, value, design, and age of structure. Per FEMA, just last week, only about 800 homes and businesses in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, and the flooding actually had insurance out of the thousands of properties that were destroyed. And most of those properties were also not in a FEMA-identified floodplain or floodway. This might be a little difficult to see, but you can find this on the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance's website. There are a few myths, I feel like, about FEMA, and sometimes they're almost interchangeably seen as insurance or an insurance-like product that makes a covered homeowner whole. If you'll look at myth number 2 there on the screen, it says, I don't need flood insurance because FEMA assistance will cover my damages, when the fact says FEMA grants an average less than $8,000. Remember, just 1 inch of water in a home can cause $25,000 worth of damage. Also on the right-hand side of your screen there, you'll see that first bullet that says, in moderate to low-risk areas, the risk of being flooded is reduced but not completely removed. 1 in 4 insurance claims comes from moderate to low flood risk areas. I know Mr. Smith has already mentioned it, but it's important to note that the 100-year floodplain means that 1% chance every year. Those 30 inches of rain that fell in East Tennessee and Western North Carolina are also part of that statistic. So that concludes my portion. I'm going to invite Mr. Crosby to come up, our Building and Codes Director, to talk about prevention.
Thank you, Lauren. Good evening, Mayor, Council. That was an impressive amount of information from Mr. Smith and Mrs. Winters. The big thing I want to do to wrap up is talk about how can we protect ourselves. As homeowners, when we're looking to buy a home, there's a handful of easy things we can do. We have tons and tons of questions when we're getting ready to buy a home. This is one I believe that gets overlooked more than any other. As a potential home buyer, the biggest thing we need to do is reach out to our realtor. If you're not dealing with a realtor and you're having a home built, deal directly with your builder. Both of those folks should be able to show you a copy of your subdivision plat, and you can look for drainage easements and retention areas on the plat. Other things you can do if you're driving by through a potential neighborhood before you meet with a builder or realtor, look for low-lying areas, look for ditches, look for any areas that may be used for drainage, for holding stormwater and retention areas. And just know that those are intended to be there, they're intended to stay, they're intended to function as part of a system. If you are dealing with a realtor and a contractor, go over the plat with them, ask questions. What do these easements look like? It's all dots and shaded areas on a piece of paper until you start going over exactly what does this mean. Is this a place where water flows? Is this a place where water holds? Is this just a ditch in my front yard, or is this a bigger retention pond that, the kids are going to be fishing in from the neighborhood? Older neighborhoods potentially may not have easements shown on the plat. There again, you can look for features, look for those ditches, look for those, if they're old enough areas that you don't see, if it wasn't a subdivision, if it didn't go through the plat process, if it was just a lot, it should have a very defined ditch, a very defined low-lying area that you can tell holds water. Ask about the property's history. A realtor should be able to give you a rundown of the property's history, neighbors. Ask questions like, has it flooded before? Does a yard hold water ever during a rain event? Additionally, reviewing with your insurance agent when you're going through the home buying process. Insurance agents are going to be reaching out to you. Ask them what that looks like. What does a policy look like that will cover me in the event of a flood? or loss to my property, during a flood. So those are not all fail safes, but those are things that you can do. We are available. The Building and Codes office is happy to sit down with any potential home buyer, any potential person looking to build a home. Sit down with us. We can look at the plat with you. If you don't feel comfortable with your realtor or builder, sit down with us. We'll go over your plat. We'll tell you what it means, and we'll show you those areas in your yard that may be impacted by a rain event. We're happy to help any way we can. So I will turn it back over to Mr. Smith.
All right, thank you, Mr. Crosby. Thank you, Mr. Smith and Ms. Winters. Members, I'll open it up for questions, but I just want to reemphasize, this is not the end. This is merely an interim report. We got a lot of more information to collect and help to provide, so we just wanted to kind of give you a status report. And so we've got our subject matter experts here, and they'll be glad to answer questions. Councilperson McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to the employees for the information. Is there a way that the full council could get a list of the potentially the addresses that you all have identified on the GIS?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay, and then also who you have heard from and who you still need to hear from, so that maybe we can follow up with the affected property owners in our ward.
We'll do it. We sent it certified restricted, and I think we got three of those back so far. So it is coming through.
Okay, and then this might be for Ms. Winters. When she spoke about 3 years of history, does that have to be consecutive or not?
With the 3 years, it doesn't have to be consecutive, but it does have to be under the current property owner. And this is also a good time to mention that if the property changes ownership, if we start this process, we would have to restart the process because the contract would be with the property owner, not a piece of property.
Okay, and then you had mentioned unless there is documentation that might show under a previous property owner that there were some issues, then that might be taken into consideration with the current property owner?
Correct. So if we can have backup from previous property owners and we can show where they applied for insurance and they were denied, TEMA can then work and look at weather data and try and kind of piecemeal that together. But again, that doesn't ensure that it'll pass the benefit cost analysis. That's just a checkbox to get us there.
I thank you for that. I think that in my ward, at least in the Freestone, Alberta Drive area, the current property owners have no knowledge that the property's flooded before, but there are people that may be able to find some information, not necessarily from the real estate agent or the property owner, so that's why I was asking.
Yes, and I had one individual reach out. It wasn't Alberta Drive, but just had some questions kind of about the process. What we sent out to folks, that's just a very consolidated version of the information team is going to ask of us. And so I know the mayor kind of said I'm the FEMA guru. I joke that I'm kind of like your FEMA attorney, right? Like I read all this stuff and I try and understand it so I can help you. So that's really what those questions are for. I read this mitigation manual, read the application. I've kind of consolidated all of it. So any questions anyone has, I encourage them to reach out. My email address is also in that letter that they received, and we'll work through it together.
Okay, so your second language is FEMA. Thank you.
Unfortunately, yeah. I did take Latin, though, so maybe Latin's still up a little bit.
Unspoken
But
language.
true,
Okay,
true,
thank you.
true.
It's all Greek to me. Councilperson Reynolds, you're recognized.
Yeah, I'd like to start with reading a couple of headlines. New flood maps show U.S. damage rising 26% in the next 30 years due to climate change alone, and the inequity is stark. Also, someone born in 2020 is predicted to experience more climate hazards in their lifetime than someone born in 65. I'd like to say that I think the city has a responsibility, and we are not paying attention. We're reacting instead of being forward thinking in our zoning and the way in our building and codes. For those who don't know, we talked about the environmental building codes. We are still building homes in our community to the 2009. We are one of the lowest ones for the environmental code. That's what's on the books, the 2009 for the environmental codes. And that means they don't have to put in the best air conditioners and harden the house for what's coming up in our areas. As we infill and build in these areas, we continue to narrow the amount of land around these wetlands and these natural areas, and we're allowing houses to be built too close to these areas as 100-year floodplains happen more and more. The 100-year floodplain doesn't matter anymore. It's with these environmental and these climate change and all of these climate disasters. I continue to tell people, remember, a hurricane literally hit East Tennessee. It's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. And we as a community and elected officials should not be continuing to create a buyer beware in our town. If we know of an area we have a financial responsibility, if we can move that water, if we can't move that water into that natural area, we are going to have to find resources to build, to move the water underground. That is what we owe our citizens if we're going to continue infill and build on these wetlands. I know in my neighborhood, there's a wetland, it stays wet all year, and I also know in this area, there's 2 homes now that have sinkholes from the edge of this area up under their homes, and their homes are a complete loss. One other thing it's important to recognize is our tree canopy in our community has been cut by 50% in the last 5 years. The tree canopy slows water, it soaks up water. Much of the flooding in many communities when they went back in and planted trees, they were able to mitigate some of the flooding. We're still allowing our community to clear cut and remove all the vegetation when we build and not put a single tree back into the communities. That's also causing much of our flooding and much of our runoff. We are building too close. I continue to say we have a responsibility not to say, not me, but a responsibility as a city council and as builders and building codes to make this let me help you, let me protect each community. We should be buying more pieces of property closer to these features, not only reacting to the people who have lost their homes, but being proactive. Green spaces in our community we're losing it very quickly. I know it's not happy tax rolls, but what's the difference on a wetland to leave some trees, and we don't have to maintain it, and it doesn't have to cost our city a lot. Thank you.
Councilperson Smith, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mayor. First, I want to thank David for doing such a great job of presenting this, and I'm so glad that some of the residents are here to hear this. I don't think that there's hope. I know someone probably feeling where there's no hope. You know, we don't have insurance, or we can't contact FEMA for help because it might be too late. And we've heard some of these complaints from some of the citizens here today, especially the lady on Alberta Drive. I remember her complaint about how she's been living in her house terribly suffering from the flooding in her area. And so I know that you said, Mr. David, that there's nothing we can do about it, but to make sure that the stormwater is flowing. And so you talked about this area here.
Sure.
You said that we could buy that.
Yeah, I'll jump back to the point of that.
Can you kind of tell me, if we bought that area, that drainage spot, or whatever you call it, how would it affect these residents who
Sure.
live around the city who are dealing with flooding?
Lots of hypotheticals in there. Yeah, absolutely. So the basin, if we were to acquire a portion of this 7-acre basin, we could do what we talk about commonly, and Mr. Tyndall talks about as a compensatory cut. We'll go through and we can remove some of the soil in that area. But again, it's referenced with the water table. Once it comes up, it doesn't matter how much we pull out of the bottom of this bowl, if you will, the water table is still there. So if we remove the sediment, if we remove the soil and whatnot, it's a Band-Aid, if you will. We might see in those smaller rain events that we wouldn't have as much ponding and that sort of stuff. It might help, again, to the 10% of assistance against what we would, spend 6-7 figures in to try to tackle. So, and the risk is here just as it was in Hayes and Love. That entire region, ultimately, this cave network, I'm certain, travels over to Armistead and whatnot across 41A. It's all one giant cave network. So you compromise any component of it by attempting to assist what's otherwise natural, and it can go south. It can absolutely damage the structure. But we are working on some preliminary schematic designs on this and Hayes and Love on what might be done to assist in those areas. But I want to assert that this wasn't a block storm drain, this wasn't any of those things, and this wasn't a city-created problem. These are problems. They're absolutely problems. Flooding is a terrible thing, and again, a natural disaster. But that's what it needs to be viewed as, a natural disaster. And no matter if we change the energy code or any of those things, it's not going to change. This was a 100-year event. This was a natural disaster as defined not by us locally, but by the federal government.
So, I appreciate that and I understand,
Yes, ma'am.
that it's not the city's fault.
Yes, ma'am.
That some of these homes have flooded, but, in the future, what can we do when these builders come forth to build? Do they have to get a certificate for flooding?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, some of those later models that we referenced, again, these were from the 60s and so on. They're much older. But the newer models like Glen Ellen Landing, the plats are very verbose. There's a lot of regulation. Those areas are shaded. These are documents that are certainly inherent in the closing process. These are available publicly on the assessor's website. As again, Justin mentioned, this is part of the stuff. This is before homes are built. All of this stuff is done. So if you're looking to build a home and work with a builder, this is information that's available prior to selection of a lot. Hey, this is where I'd like to build. These are the challenges with this particular lot. And it's accompanied by, prior to the closing, prior to the home being done, elevation certificates that we talked about later. So before we give a CO, before we say it's safe to occupy this home, they have to provide an engineer's survey showing that the home, the HVAC equipment, all of those things is above the FEMA flood elevation for that area, as assigned by the developing engineer.
So that's what we're doing now.
Absolutely. It's a very, very elaborate process now. But again, as we referenced with Cook Drive, we are building up against drainage areas. This is the substance of infill development. You know, the clear cutting and stuff that was referenced earlier, a lot of that land's gone. What's left are these spaces between that were at one point in the development world undesirable. And now as that land becomes occupied, those large areas, we start to see some infill development.
Well, thank you for helping me to understand better more about this. So what can we do now for these citizens who are homeowners that are having problems? Can we give them any kind of money to help them? I've heard this, what is that, Alberta Drive lady speak. I mean, you know, and I feel so sorry for her, but what can we do to try to help our citizens? I know that there are taxpayers in this city. What can we do? I know it's not our fault. What can we do?
That's not what this meeting's about,
I
but
know.
we are working through federal, state, and local resources to try to help. But we're not there yet.
Well, you know, Mayor, we ask these questions because we want the citizens to understand that we're trying to do something to help them. This is what the meeting is about. It is about telling us about the drainage and the flooding. And then I want to ask, on behalf of these citizens, what can we do? I mean, you know, it's about the citizen. That's why we gave this presentation. It is about what can we do to better things here in this city. It is about our citizens who are taxpayers. It is about us trying to be forward marching and taking preventions so that things will not happen the same way again. It is about many things. So, I mean, as my job as a council person, I'm going to speak up for the citizens. I know that the mayor don't think we should, but we are going to do that. Okay?
Hang on.
We need to stop all this objecting. I mean, that's all they do, object. Every time you say something that's important for our citizens, they want to object because they want you not to stand up. But I'm going to stand up regardless of what the negative people say. Okay. So now, let me finish. So what are we going to do to try to help these people? And I heard what the mayor said. We're still looking into this. I want to know what we're going to do to help these people who have been crying out for a long time. What are we going to do? I know it's not the city's fault based on what you showed us, but what are we going to do?
When we get to a solution or a list of solutions, we'll report that back. But we're not there
Good.
yet. I'm not saying this meeting is not to discuss solutions, but we're not ready to say we're going to do this for this property and that for that property.
I didn't say that, Mayor. I asked the question, what are we planning to do for
And
the
I've-
future?
And
That's
I've
all I
answered
said.
it.
If you'll
Ms.
allow me
Winters?
just a moment. So, one of the things that we talked about, as the mayor mentioned, we've had several conversations, several meetings, because this is our hometown too. And so, you know, what can we do to help our neighbors, right? And so, outside of FEMA, I'm the grants director. And so I always say, all of our tax dollars have gone to a federal level, right? My job is to bring those home. And I take that very personally and professionally. I love winning grant awards for y'all because I love bringing that home because we've all paid for it. So one of the ways that we can help in the grants office is through navigating through this property acquisition process. Because again, those TEMA and FEMA dollars, those are taxpayer dollars. We have paid towards those programs. I know a lot of times we think in terms of help, it has to be a financial transaction, right? I think that as well. But it's also important to note the advocacy. So I am advocating. I don't know if my FEMA and TEMA hazard mitigation folks are watching this, but they could tell you the countless hours, 100 hours easily, that I've had conversations with them, following up. And as I mentioned to Ms. McLaughlin, you know, when people respond and say, hey, I have this, but I don't have this. Okay, give it to me. Like, let me run it back for you. So that is something that we are doing as a city. So as the mayor mentioned, this isn't the end. This is just the beginning of, hey, this is what we're working on. But I want you to rest assured that me personally, in my office, under the blessing of my CFO, the direction of the mayor, we are working to be those advocates and to bring those tax dollars back home.
Well, thank you so much for
You're
trying to
welcome.
bring some hope to these people when some sit here and don't want to. Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Mayor.
Councilperson Allen, you're recognized.
So why wouldn't someone be aware? Because I know when the young lady from Alberta Drive came and spoke to us, nobody ever informed her that this house was built like it was, where it was at, or like she said, she would have made different decisions.
Yeah, I think I spoke to Ms. Payne, I think the day after one of those
So,
May events.
Why wouldn't the city know? I mean, if it's platted, why wouldn't that be something that's required to be disclosed?
I can't speak to that. Legally, I feel it should have been disclosed. I feel like that should have been, and again, as Justin, Mr. Crosby mentioned, that's a conversation with your realtor. That's a private transaction. What's the history on this property? Has this property flooded? One of the case studies we went through, the gentleman in his email to the council said, I was aware that this property flooded multiple times, but I thought maybe it was fixed, and he still acquired the property. So it's not a catch-all that you have that prerequisite, knowing that this property has flooded. Maybe it's been mitigated. Maybe it was a one-off. Maybe it was just because it was the 2010 flood or whatever. But no, I firmly believe she did not have knowledge in advance that the
Right.
property had flooded previously.
I mean, what we're saying is this is 100-year floodplain.
Yes.
Okay, this is what we're saying for this specific case.
Sure.
So if it's 100-year floodplain, where is the rules and regulations that state that has to be disclosed? Do we have something on our books?
Again, it didn't exist when that subdivision was platted, when that home was built. Those rules weren't in place. The design standard at the
I'm
time.
talking about the disclosure.
Sure.
I'm talking about
again,
today.
Yeah, I can't speak to that either.
The house was sold 2 or 3 years ago.
Not a city process. I can't speak to that. That's a private transaction.
But it may be a private transaction, but as a city, don't we have some, okay, well, these things need to be disclosed when you're buying a house, even if it's a private transaction?
No, none of those exist. And to lead into, could we assign, because one of the things that Ms. Winters mentioned was assigning a 100-year elevation to these lots. That is a retroactive function. So in the case of Alberta Drive, Ms. Payne, could we assign a 100-year elevation to her property? Absolutely. But also, as Ms. Winters referenced, it might pick up 8, 10, 15 homes that had no knowledge of an elevation, that can't afford thousands of dollars in flood insurance suddenly because they're on a fixed income. And now they don't have a choice. They have to pay that.
Okay, so I have another question. What about the people that have a total loss right now? It says 3 years.
Yes.
But if my house is a total loss this year, because I didn't have 15 inches of water in my house, how can I get 2 more years worth of?
I think Lauren can speak to that, but I think it's not only 3 years, but it's 3 separate. So if you had 3 separate incidents within a single year, it wouldn't qualify.
No. I understand that.
Sure.
What I'm saying is my house is a total loss right now.
Right. I think under the template, it wouldn't qualify under the existing template that we're after. It's not stopping us from applying and exploring that process and checking those boxes and making the effort. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes, so just to echo what he said, that is just us interpreting exactly from TEMA their application. So the city of Clarksville is receiving TEMA's guidance. TEMA has been so fantastic, they even reached out personally to emphasize, hey, I did some reading, I want to make sure you see this portion. It's like a 700-page document, this hazard mitigation plan. So it is those 3 years of loss. Also, the hope is that some of these property owners would have their own flood insurance. So when we say mandatory flood insurance, we're talking about that national flood insurance program that you have to participate in, right? If you're in a newly identified flood zone. And as Mr. Smith mentioned, they could say, okay, here's the 100-year floodplain, that 1% chance in a year, and now it affects 50 homes. And they're like, what? I didn't call anybody. It's that unintended harm, because now they will be required, if they have a federally backed mortgage, which a lot of folks do, they will be required to get it. And so then there leads to that. But yes, it is 3 separate years. So I personally am with you. I was like, say that one more time. But it's their rules. It's 3 separate years. And that's just for the benefit cost analysis. Again, it has to score high on that BCA to even be submitted as an application. So that's just step 1.
Okay, one more question. So I understand looking into FEMA, natural disasters and everything else. Have we looked into any other programs? Have we looked into HUD? Have we looked into any type of rehabilitation programs? I mean, there's a lot of grants through those agencies too. Have we looked into any of that yet?
I personally have looked through the TEMA hazard mitigation process. I have not looked beyond that.
Are we planning to look beyond that? Because I know I work at HUD. So I know there's a lot of rehabilitation stuff through HUD also that could be something that we could look at helping our people with versus just FEMA. While I understand it's a natural disaster.
Yes, so we have the CNCS who has their own, they do all the HUD funding, they do it that route. We are more than happy to go back and have conversations about that.
Okay.
And Michelle Austin has been at the table with our discussions too.
For this? Okay. That's all.
Councilperson Reynolds, you recognized?
Yeah, I'd just like to verify that when I went to the accessor property, I was talking about people that bought a home that didn't have knowledge that it had HOA, but I was under the impression, or I was told, that to be able to see what's on the accessor website, you have to go directly to the accessor property. It is not available to the public unless you go on their computers. I'm pretty certain, because I looked at that. I went and had that visit. And the real estate have to pay for it. They have access via the website because they pay for it. So the regular citizen and some of the documentation you showed, you have to know that process to go get that data. I'm very
Sure, but
certain of
that's
that.
not necessarily a process that a citizen needs to know. That's why you have a realtor. That's why you have those professionals that are commissioned
Right, but
to do that
we're
work.
talking, so let's just, again, we're saying, we know these properties now are in the 100-year floodplain,
No,
right?
that's not correct.
No, some of these are, but we're not going to do that because we don't want them to have to pay insurance. So then the houses continue to change until we have an incident. And we've passed on this issue for decades until there's something that's really bad. But nobody has insurance now because we didn't go back and do it like we should in the first place.
That's not accurate. We're not turning a blind eye to this. We're simply saying this is the process that FEMA has in order for us to declare it in the FEMA 100-year floodplain. We have to invite them in. We have to pay for the process. And oh, by the way, if your house falls in that 100-year floodplain and you weren't aware and you didn't call us, you're going to have to get flood insurance. That's an unintended consequence, and that's something that certainly we will alert property owners to. But once we call FEMA in, we don't get to carve out what we want.
Point of information, Mayor.
Sure.
I think my question for that is, I think she was talking about past, not future. When she was saying it's been passed along, and so the customer doesn't know.
Well,
Right.
past or present.
Some of the owners selling the house doesn't know.
Well, I get it, and we didn't know until we started doing a really deep dive into this situation. And Mr. Smith and the GIS division that we created and others have helped us identify where the water's coming from and potentially what the impacts are. So we're just giving you an interim report. We're not saying we're there yet. Here's what we're going to do. This is merely what we've got, the information we have at this point. We're not stopping. We're just giving you a report because you've heard citizens come and talk about flooding and what are you doing? And so we thought we need to give you an interim report on what we're doing.
I would also like to ask that part of this project include a complete review of our building and codes and our requirements at the Regional Planning Commission, because we need to have a larger circle around some of these wet areas and stop building so close to them. We need to see what we can do and how we can protect our residents in the future. Because much of this issue, again, I can see it in my own community. The water is where it wasn't because we built a neighborhood up on the hill. We took down all the trees, we took down all the space, and now we've pushed that water closer and closer, and now it's backing up to houses that it had not been backed up 10 years ago. So I would like to also ask that we ensure that there are grants, et cetera, to do that, and that we overhaul from the bottom up. This is a conversation I had when we were doing the plan at Regional Planning Commission as well, that we asked to overhaul our building and codes and all of our codes as we infill our community.
Councilperson McLaughlin.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll try to start with you, but then I'm sure some of these are going to be for Ms. Winters. Almost every month at the Transportation Street and Garage Committee, I know Councilmember Reynolds and myself have brought up drainage concerns on our ward. And we've asked for information you've been providing, and you mentioned that the new GIS system was going to add a flag to lots that potentially could have flood issues.
That's correct.
That will be publicly available, correct, so that people will be able to research if they are looking to move to an area. So that's something that you all have done as part of the studying of the flood area.
It will be, but I
Yeah.
want to assert briefly.
Okay, but it's
that-
in process and,
Yeah.
okay,
But the issue is, as much as we can guide development on that lot, we can't inhibit development unless we acquire the property. So again, we can assert control and say, you have to grade it, it has to be graded a certain way, you have to do this engineering, you have to do these different levels, or we have to acquire, because otherwise, to assert control is a taking.
okay, more specifically, existing homes on lots.
Sure.
So there, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought that there would be an identifier on the GIS that would indicate if they were at risk or not.
I don't know that we have any built lots that are on that. It would be undeveloped infill lots, but we can look into adding, those. Those wouldn't be 100-year, those wouldn't be,
Right.
qualifiers for different federal programs and
Right,
so on, but
just an identifier.
sure.
We're a transient community.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, lots in our neighborhood, Alberta Drive and that, have been there, the homes have been there since 1980s, and they keep changing
Sure.
and changing and changing. So that would definitely, if you are able to do that,
think
that
we
would
can
be
handle that.
greatly appreciated. And then also, in the purple highlighted areas, flood areas in the Spees Drive, Danielle Drive area in Alberta, and I would assume you probably have looked over at Saratoga, Bunker Hill, that area for
Yeah,
the
those are
same issues.
FEMA elevations as well.
I know that by rule, because you taught us this at TSG, is that if your yard holds water, it wouldn't be considered flooding.
Correct.
But I see some of these areas, it is just the yard and may not necessarily get under the house. So how do you all differentiate if you do go back and look at the FEMA, adding a 100-year floodplain?
Sure.
Will it be carved out where the elevation is so that it would just get in the living area of the house and not
That's it.
necessarily?
Yeah,
Okay.
finished flow elevation is what the trigger is for FEMA, and then, of course, HVAC equipment and other equipment associated with the
Okay.
home. Water can enter a crawl space. Water often enters crawl spaces, and the building code allows for water to enter crawl spaces. Again, FEMA's concern is that it's above finished floor elevation.
Okay.
So slab homes and stuff like that would be directly affected.
Okay, I wanted to ask that for clarification. And then also, part of the budget, I, as a voting body, identified the study of the Love Drive area and the Alberta Drive area. Before seeking FEMA to declare a 100-year floodplain, will all of the affected property owners be contacted prior to that process?
Well, it's difficult. We don't know. We are guessing. And when we put the map up for Alberta Drive, there is no FEMA 100-year elevation for that area. That's our estimation of what it could be. So if we identify and we alert property owners, you could be affected, we probably have to buffer that a little bit and alert property owners beyond that, just to make sure that if they were tagged by that elevation, that they had some notice. But yeah, once, as the mayor said, once that process starts, it can't be undone.
Right.
What we're looking at presently, in addition to what Ms. Winters has referenced, is a ground penetrating radar and a number of other features to study the basin, the subsurface, and see what features are there beneath the soil that we might be able to utilize to help with this groundwater table. And we're not optimistic because the depth of that equipment isn't great, but we want to exhaust those things. We want to survey that area and see what we can get done.
Okay, clarification. I know that we had had conversations about going back to areas that have flooded, that are not in the 100-year floodplain,
Yes.
to talk to FEMA about identifying those.
Correct, absolutely.
That's what I'm speaking about.
Yes.
So prior to that process, formally applying to FEMA for that boundary, would the affected property owners be notified that, hey, we're looking at doing this? You may not have flooding now in your house, but this will now require you to, if this does go through by FEMA, you will be required to obtain the proper flood insurance.
I'll answer that, yes, absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Mayor. Because in the area, in several areas in the city that have had water in the actual homes, they haven't been allowed to have flood insurance because it was not areas identified. And so I'm just looking at how we prevent that in the future. So thank you, Mr. Smith, and thank you, Mayor. And then I just want to reiterate, Ms. Winter stated what the process is. This may not have been understood by everyone, that the affected property owners have been identified. They've received by certified mail a questionnaire that they fill out. Once they submit that, then the process starts to see where we are able to help them, the potential of helping them get some kind of assistance. Is that correct?
Correct. So I mentioned that it's multiple applications, but they all move together as one. The application itself is dozens of pages. So we want to make sure that they actually qualify to proceed with it, because if they do not, bless you, if they do not pass that benefit cost analysis, that BCA, then I would hate to send them through that months and years long application process just to get to the end and say, I'm so sorry, Tima said you didn't pass the BCA. So there's a score that happens on the BCA. It's something that we had to do recently with our generators for the fire department, for example. Had to go through and show the number of citizens that are affected by a faulty door not opening at the fire department if the generator fails. I mean, that's how specific I had to go through and do ferment maps, just showing the impact of it. And that was just for a generator that I'm just putting on a concrete slab. So you go to the process, and like I mentioned, we talk about property acquisition and demolition, but FEMA could come out and say, actually, it's more cost effective for us to elevate that property. We don't get to say, no, we want to do the other. They're going to say it's this or nothing. So with that questionnaire, went through, worked with TEMA, sent it to them, said, hey, does this kind of capture that initial information that we need? Some of the questions that we had, it was a one answer only, but then there were some for like backup documentation. It's like select all that apply, because hey, the more backup documentation you have, the higher that BCA score is going to be, right? So that is what the intent of that is just to kind of capture it all and just be honest with each other. Like I mentioned, we're advocates through this process. It is a big undertaking. And I know that even as someone who's the FEMA expert, I have to reread things 3 times. And so I want to be that advocate to try and help and funnel it through. So that questionnaire is just that initial ask. If you don't have A, B, and C, let me reach out to TEMA. Hey, we don't have A and B. Okay, well then I now need D. So that's what that process is on that, just to get you past that benefit cost analysis.
Thank you. Is there somewhere online that maybe there's a webinar or something or a video that shows people how to fill out the applications?
So the application itself, only the city or a local nonprofit can apply through this process. And I mentioned that in that slide there. FEMA has several different programs. I know we were familiar with the individual assistance that occurred after the tornado, right? And that's because that was a federally declared disaster, that tornado was. And each disaster has its own number. I believe the tornado was 4751. And so they first declared individual assistance, which meant boots on the ground. FEMA came out, helped affected citizens, right? It was a good 2 months before public assistance, which is where we apply for the firefighters, the police officers, the debris removal from the right of way. That came 60 days later, right? So that's individual assistance is what we're used to in Clarksville, is those boots on the ground after the tornado. With the hazard mitigation program, which is through TEMA, applying to FEMA, an individual citizen cannot apply directly for that program. They must utilize local government or a local nonprofit. So then we, as the city of Clarksville, we step in kind of as that attorney agent, right? And we go to bat for them. So that's how hazard mitigation works. So it's different than individual assistance under disasters.
Okay, so the short version is that once they send the questionnaires, then you will help fill everything, you'll fill everything out and submit it as a lump.
Correct. So
Okay.
once they submit the responses to those questionnaires, I will work with my TEMA program manager and say, hey, these are the properties. This is the backup documentation we have. What can I do with it? He might come back and say, you need A, B, and C. I will reach out to that individual property owner and say, hey, submitted your information to TEMA. This is what we need next. We want to get on past that benefit cost analysis. And like we mentioned, it is going to require that elevation certificate. I know Mr. Smith mentioned FFE, that finished floor elevation or flood floor elevation. We have to prove that it's coming beyond that. We have to order those. That will have a cost to it. And then also order that FEMA flood mapping. In my perfect world, by the end of the calendar year, but I don't know. And so again, that is just one of the pieces towards that benefit cost analysis.
Thank you. I think this is probably one of the best work sessions I've attended in however many years. And thank you for speaking in layman's terms, because that's my language.
I was raised by an educator turned principal, and she'll be so excited to hear that. So
Okay,
thank
thank you.
Thank you.
Councilperson Streetman, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mayor. First of all, I want to start off by saying thank you for all the work that you all have done on this, and great job presenting everything to us tonight. And I'm not only thanking you for the work you've done currently, but are continuing to do. One thing I do really want to note is we've sat up here and we've asked questions about how can we be proactive, how can we, help more on the front end. One exceptional piece of information I feel like we received tonight was actually from Mr. Crosby when he talked about how can you protect yourself, and the final slide and everything that was listed there, and even offered for individuals that are looking at buying a property or building a home to please reach out to building and codes and talk to them in addition to everything that he listed on here. And I think that was just such a beneficial suggestion. I mean, I realize there are people that are hurting now that are already dealing with issues, but this is a way that we can be proactive, that our city is being proactive by offering that assistance to be able to look at it. And then I'm going to add a little bit more of a question to that, and I'm not really sure if I would direct that to Mr. Smith, to the mayor, or who, building and codes, where this would really need to go. But we, of course, have our link on the website for See-Click-Fix. I think I'm using the right terminology. Often in the past, there have been, as we've seen through this, these two, 100-year floods that we experienced in May, we've gotten lots of communication that's been sent to street department, different various areas. Would there be a way that someone could reach out through there to ask if there has been a history of flooding? Because as we've said, that one of the women that came here and spoke, she wasn't aware, she wasn't told anything about any previous issues. Would there be a way that an individual could reach out through there and find out if there's been any information, any reports of flooding of a certain property? Would that have to be a public records request? I don't know. I made that question very broad, and I apologize. It's just I'm trying to think through because this is a work session.
I don't really know the simple answer to that question, because I'm not sure we maintain records regarding individual lots. I I don't know.
Might be institutional knowledge. It might be,
Yeah.
just the knowledge of those folks that have worked storm management for the past decades, that they might have some knowledge of it, especially if it's one of our present applicants. We would certainly do our due diligence to try and get that information.
Yeah, and I wasn't looking for really anything that would be exceptionally difficult. And, it's just more, would there be a way I can send a email, an address, click, do something to say, do you have a history of reports to, again, the street department of flooding? And like I said, it's just a thought. I literally had moments before I hit my buttons.
We'll discuss that in our next meeting and
Sounds
talk
good.
about some sort of portal that people could send an email or make an inquiry.
Yeah.
If we can do that safely and accurately, we'll certainly do that.
Well, and again, I know I said it already once, but getting this information out that Mr. Crosby gave us of how you can protect yourself, I think that is, again, everything you all did was great. That's something that I keyed right in on it, how we could be proactive.
Councilperson Lovato, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mayor. This, just piggybacking off of that in the previous conversation about disclosures, it's my understanding that the seller and the real estate agents do have an obligation to disclose it, and it's regulated by state law. So really, I have a request of information. Is it possible for the city attorney to do that research and give it to the city council members, just so we can help educate future consumers and real estate agents about what proper protocol looks like?
Absolutely. If you'll send an email to Mr. Bittner, and then whatever he provides can be distributed.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilperson Reynolds?
Yeah, I'd just like to piggyback off the last comment. I had asked, there's certain city property that we are holding that we know is drainage and that should not be sold. A couple years ago at the end of Pea Ridge, we allowed a piece of property that had been on city books for a long time to be sold, and the house had to be elevated because it had water, so the water could flow underneath it right at the end of Pea Ridge and Needmore. We should mark those pieces of property that we know are holding water and keep them on the map when we have the GIS. That's the institutional knowledge that we have already. People should go in and mark what they know on our GS map, and that would be helpful. And I will just say, one more time is I would like to strengthen our building codes and our building requirements, so we are not creating a buyer beware where buyers have to go find the building and codes or go find these maps, that they are required and the information is put out for everyone. And if it's not a safe lot and we allow it to be built, then we should be marking it so people can find it easily. I bought a house every 3 years of my adult life when I was in the Army. My house currently has a septic tank that is not, I have 2/3 of an acre. My septic tank is sitting under the floodplain in an easement, and so is my neighbors across the street, because back in the day when they built our house in the 90s, our lots didn't PERT, even though they were big lots. So when I bought a house, who would know, right? Until my neighbor's septic tank flooded. So every time it floods, my septic tank and my leach lines are underwater, and it drains right back into the Red River. So, so I understand the buyer beware, and that's why I feel pretty strongly that people don't know. Young people, I was in my 30s, but who would have known until then? And that's not what we want as a city.
Councilperson Smith?
Thank you. In concern for the citizens who are suffering under the flood, storms and hurricanes, whatever has happened to cause them to flood, I heard a mayor mention something that Michelle Austin was here. Is there something she can do at the housing community and development level? Is there anything?
Well, she's heard the discussion, and we will certainly be talking about what other monies, resources, we'll say, are available.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? The purpose for which this special session of the Clarksville City Council having been accomplished, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you all.